What's up, my fellow scruffy looking nerf herders, and welcome to the Carbonite Chat. Today we're going to be talking about kind of some excerpts from a book that came out with the James Cameron, kind of when he discussed and he had his TV show called The Story of Science Fiction. It goes into that a little bit, and particularly with George Lucas kind of giving some ideas or thoughts to what would have been for him episodes 7, 8, and 9. Now all these articles have come out talking about how it's a terrible idea, that it wouldn't work, that this is just the worst part of Star Wars, and that it's a great thing that George didn't do it. Now, am I saying that this is like a surefire winner? No, but I do think that they're misrepresenting it. They're basically saying that it's just going to be the story of midichlorians. And to some extent, it kind of could be, but I don't think it would be in the way that they're trying to represent it. I think it's kind of a straw man how they're representing it. They're just kind of tossing it away. And they're missing kind of some of the key points. It refers to them that as they're going to be a microbiotic creatures in this kind of microbiotic world. But he says that it's going to be about the wills. Now, in the defense of the people writing the articles, George Lucas says himself that he doesn't believe that the fans, he thinks that a lot of fans probably wouldn't have liked it anyways, but this is what he would have wanted to do. And I want to kind of go against these articles for two reasons. One, it's just the typical thing that everyone wants to do now with these articles. It's like the fans are terrible. All the fans suck. So let's just show, oh, of course, anything George Lucas would have done, you would have hated that too. So ha ha ha, see, he wanted to do midichlorians and it would have been bad. See, you're better off with what you got now. And is there a potential that it could have been bad? Yes. I mean, I'm not a fan. I'm not the biggest fan of the prequels, but, keeping away what's happened with the sequels for the topic of this with the Disney sequels, I think tossing away George Lucas's ideas, nothing good could have come from it, is completely wrong. And here's why I say this. If you look at it, he's already kind of touched on the wills and touched on what I believe is kind of the basis of his idea. Even though, yes, it was put out in the Clone Wars in season 6, or the unfinished series, unfinished missions, episodes 11, 12, and 13, Yoda goes and basically visits this microbiotic world and he meets the wills. And what he does there is he begins to understand and learn about how to become one with the Force and be able to commune with the living after he's died. And this was the last 3 episodes that George Lucas did with Star Wars. And I think that over time, when he decided and started to get back the idea of maybe doing another movie again, maybe after a lot of people really liked the Clone Wars, he felt a little bit better and kind of maybe felt a little bit of his mojo back. And I think that this was kind of a story that stuck with him. And I think that it could have worked really well for episodes 7, 8, and 9. So I want to kind of go over some of them and kind of explain why I think it would have worked and whether or not, discuss down below whether or not you think that this would work as well. But ultimately what happens in the Clone Wars series is that Yoda gets kind of this, he hears the voice and it's Qui-Gon Jinn, but of course they don't believe, the Jedi don't believe that there's life after death. And so he's kind of confused by it. Long story short, he ends up, wanting to find out whether or not it's true, and he heads off to Dagobah, which is where Qui-Gon sent him. When he gets to Dagobah, he then gets there and he follows these lights, and the lights begin to lead him to where he needs to be. Now, these lights are what later on becomes the wills. These are the microbiotic creatures, and yes, as a lot of the articles say, that if you just had these little microbiotic, lights that you're following around, it's going to be like, this is kind of stupid. But I think for like the beginning of the story with Luke in episode 7, or as the whole first episode, if you combine it with at the very end of these 3 episodes in Clone Wars, it mentions again that there is another Skywalker. Now, to me, this is interesting because there's also been a lot of talk from George Lucas that his idea for the sequels was that there was another Skywalker, that there was another sister hidden away or cousin of some sort to Luke, and that he would travel and go find her. And that, to me, the fact that this was the last thing of Lucas that he put out, even though it's kind of widely accepted, and I'm not really sure how you could come up with where there is another sister or another, a cousin or a relative of some sort. I mean, I guess it could happen, but we know this, that George had this in mind, that Luke then heads out to go and find her. When he goes and finds her, she's in this location, and she begins to kind of discuss with him about this, planet, this area that she can't fully understand or accept. But then Luke begins to understand it and kind of grasp a little bit about it, because he knows that Yoda became a Force ghost, and he's able to commune with Yoda and Obi-Wan, and that leads them on this journey into this world to begin to get tested. And the first one is more along the lines of discovering these new worlds, and it can work well because, one, it doesn't affect that all of a sudden you've got to twist it to where everything Luke did, everything that happened in the original trilogy is just for naught. Like now, all of a sudden, 30 years later, everything they did, the First Order is just completely taken over. And so what? You're not really special because you didn't end up doing anything. Instead of having that, you keep the original trilogy, their victories there as completely how it was before. But then what you do, because also Rian Johnson was right in his idea, somewhat right. I'm obviously a huge, I'm very much against Rian Johnson, so that hasn't changed. But he is correct in the idea that if a character is too overpowered, that they're not as interesting, and that was kind of his idea behind Luke, but of course he did it terribly wrong. But what you could do here is, instead of trying to just weaken him and make him a coward like he ends up doing in that movie, you can end up taking him and putting him into a situation that he has had no chance to have, the preparation or being ready for it. And much like Yoda does in this, he's not prepared. He has no idea who these wills are. And once Qui-Gon tells him that he needs to go to one of the place of origins for where the original like life began, and he heads to this planet and finds it, and he sees these kind of microbiotic lights then manifest themselves into a full figure. So for those people that are just like, oh, it sounds like Osmosis Jones, where we're going to be going inside the body of people and seeing like the midichlorians moving around the blood cells. This is what I mean by the straw man argument of what's going on and not really understanding what's come before with Star Wars. They're actually pretty cool looking creatures, and they're on this world that's just like the presence of the Force as a whole. And he begins to ask them and learn from them, and they basically think that he's not even prepared for the testing. They don't think that he has a chance to survive the testing, pass the testing, or anything like that. And I think this could also work with Luke. See, we had Yoda was the wisest, the top Jedi of anyone alive at that point. So when he goes there and hits a struggle for him, and they don't think he can make it, and he does struggle some through these testing, it can equally be done with Luke, but you never kind of take away what Luke's done before. You don't change his character. And doing this, you can then allow him to find these people. And then the second episode, that's supposed to be more on the dark side, is where he begins to go and get tested. And this is also what happens with Yoda. His first test is that he's got to deal with fear. And they say that the fear obviously leads to kind of evil, which is what we've heard before somewhat with the prequels. But as Yoda begins to go in there, what he sees is a dark manifestation of himself, a dark side Yoda. It's this kind of black figure with red eyes, but it's Yoda, and they begin to fight each other. And Yoda says that he's defeated him, but he says, no, you haven't defeated me, because you're fighting a war, and the more you battle, the more you go to war, the stronger I build. And if you ignore me and you try to pretend you don't have anything inside of you of any level of conflict, then I'm going to grow so strong that I'm going to devour you. And so they begin to fight and battle it out until Yoda's able to basically defeat the evil inside of him. And once he does that, the Wills then begin to congratulate him and offer him up another test. This next test is when Yoda has to see all of the death that's coming around him, and some death that maybe doesn't quite happen the way it's actually going to happen. But the point is here is they test him out to allow him to figure out that people are going to live and die, and if you're going to be living past what happens now, because that's one of the things that's said later with Yoda, is that the Sith view only now. They want to gain all the power and all the abilities now, and they want to try to live to be immortal, but their immortal is like, I don't want to die. And what this is kind of bringing out is that the Sith and bringing balance is that they're this kind of, poison to the Force, that they're corrupting it. And so that's why they need to be destroyed. And so the Jedi's goal is to be able to be one with the Force, to be pure. And so that actually would mean dying, as they're explaining, because the living Force dies off and breathes into the cosmic Force. And so again, this is all very different. This is all kind of this huge kind of philosophical, spiritual kind of ideals. But George liked to do something different with each trilogy. And this is doing something different, and I think that it could be interesting. I think these 3 episodes in Clone Wars, I very much enjoyed. So many people love Clone Wars. So to just blindly say that when you have 3 episodes in a Clone Wars series that basically do what George is talking about he wanted to do in movies, that seems like to me is the most, the best explanation of what this little excerpt was. That's what he's wanting to do. To just say that the fans would hate it is ignoring what's actually happened in the past. And it's ignoring the facts of what was the big complaints about what happened. Now again, I hope he would have another writer come on, another director. I hope he would have someone that would kind of hold him in a little bit, rein him in, prevent him from doing everything he wants, because I think that was a big issue with the prequels, is that he just had free reign. The original trilogies, he had his wife coming in to kind of help him with editing and make some adjustments to the story. Same with Brian De Palma. And then of course we know with Empire you had Lawrence Kasdan, Leah Brackett, Irvin Kushner, all these people. And as they end up going on, it made things better because they could rein him in. And I think if you could rein him in a little bit and control him, these ideas could build into something really interesting and really cool. So Yoda goes and he's seeing the death around him. And the challenge is that he's being tested on whether or not he would give up on this future learning, the ability to learn how to become one with the Force, to be able to protect just anyone. Because again, if he knows a lot, if he knows all this stuff that's happening, he could be able to manipulate and do things. And if he has too much of an attachment to some people, then he would try to stop them from dying or being hurt, and that could negatively affect ultimately, what the desire of the Force or the will is to happen. And that can't be the case if you're going to be able to be allowed to then commune with the living after death, is basically what I'm kind of getting at, and I think is actually what they're trying to discuss. So he's tested with this and seeing the death, seeing the hurt. He actually talks with Ahsoka, and Ahsoka's like, how did you let this happen? And then one of the wills is serenity, and she offers him the opportunity to go to a place where there's no war, there's no peace, everyone's still alive. And she says, follow me. She follows, and as he's following her, and it's actually the manifestation is another Jedi named Addie that I believe had actually died by this point, was killed by Savage Opress. But as they go there, he's then walking around the temple's this beautiful kind of light, and he's like, it's what it was like before the war. And she says, there's no war here, there's no war, it's only peace and serenity. And he's just kind of confused by that. As he walks up, there's Count Dooku. And with Count Dooku being there, and he's telling a story as when he was Yoda's Padawan, but then Yoda ends up realizing that this isn't real, that this is fake, and that's not okay. And then Count Dooku kind of turns into his dark, evil side, and then he kind of defeats or wins that temptation yet again. He will ultimately he understands that there is this life and death that has to be there. You can't save everyone, it'll never happen. And so trying to go to that extent is going to lead to more issues in the end, and so he passed that test. It's then after that they're sent, they said that you need to head to Moraband, which Moraband is kind of the place of Sith. And as he's flying there, it's one of his final tests. And when he gets there, these snakes begin to just appear all around him. And as they're kind of appearing and sliding all around him, they kind of build up into this creature, and the creature says that we are the Sith, and that, you know, you're going to die here. And he's like, I don't fear you. And as they come down, it collapses down, and then these other figures all appear around him in a circle. As they appear around in a circle, they start talking and saying that how, you know, there is no life after death. Once you die, there's nothing else, that you've been being lied to, that you're going to die here. And when you die here, you're going to be over, and your life is going to be done, and nothing's going to happen afterwards. That's the truth of what's going on. And they're basically like the Sith version of the Wills. And then they go and kind of like run at him, kind of like we've seen the Wills do before. And he says that he has no fear of them, and then he begins to walk inside. And once he walks inside, there's this, you know, kind of Sith temple. There's a tomb there, and this huge statue of what is Darth Bane. And Darth Bane begins to, you know, question him about, you know, why are you here? Do you fear me? Do you know who I am? And, you know, do you know why I'm always remembered? Because he started the rule of two. And, you know, Yoda refuses to, you know, he offers you, do you want to be able to learn from me? And Yoda says, there's nothing that you can teach me. And then Darth Bane gets up in his face, and Yoda says, I have no fear of you. And this begins to defeat Darth Bane. And as he then walks forward, there's just kind of like a skull-looking statue or kind of cave thing. And the Wills appear and tell him that this is where the Sith used to kind of sacrifice Jedi. And they said that you be warned, because inside of there will be some answers, but that doesn't mean you need to take those answers. Like, just because you get some form of answers, that doesn't mean it's the best thing for you to do. So be careful when you go inside of there. And he goes inside of there, and that's when he sees Sifo Dyas. Now, Sifo Dyas, as far as the story of the Clone Wars is going, is the person that they were trying to find out whether or not he is alive. He's the one that, if you remember from Attack of the Clones, signed off on trying to begin to build the clone army, and that was what began this kind of passage of finding it. So that would make sense, that kind of the manifestation that Yoda would see would be Sifo Dyas, kind of like, you know, chained up, so to speak. And Sifo begins to explain to him that I've been here forever, please help me. And Yoda's like, he says, help me. If you help me, I will show you who it is that you're seeking. I will show you the Sith Lord, because I know who it is. And he says that, you know, and that person is the one that can tell you all the things that you need to know, all the things that you want to learn, he can teach you. And Yoda says, no, Sith, there's nothing that Sith can have that to teach me that I can, you know, need to learn from. And when he kind of starts to fight back or argue a little bit, Yoda begins to spin around a circle, and Yoda gets dropped through and kind of goes into another vision where he's headed to fight against what we find to be Count Dooku and Darth Sidious. But of course, it's just another manifestation to test him. I won't go as far into that right now, because in particularly, it's the secondary story, and it doesn't really follow what would kind of fit with 7, 8, and 9 for Luke, because Emperor Palpatine has died, and obviously Count Dooku has. And so but there's a secondary story going along with what I've been explaining for these 3 episodes, because of course you would have to have a secondary kind of storyline happening. But this is particularly following maybe the main story A, as well as what would happen with Luke and what he would be learning. So in this, what you would get in essence is Luke going, and we see Luke learning and studying how to become one with the Force, how to become a Force ghost. And yes, for some of the, you know, big fans, we've seen this happen in Clone Wars with Yoda, but we can see it on a larger scale. We can see it kind of delved into on a much larger extent with Luke. We can see it where, you know, the possibility of him meeting another sister or another relative that is strong in the Force, that is a, you know, type of Jedi. And instead of trying to create something that then we have episode 10, episode 11, episode 12, episode 13, we complete the story of Luke Skywalker. And see, it began with the story of the Skywalkers. And so yes, we do have the completion of the battle for now, but as this story is kind of explaining, that the truth about the Force and the truth about the, you know, Jedi and the Sith is this understanding, especially now where we're at in the storyline of the end of episode 6, and even right here what's going on in Clone Wars, that the Sith believe there's nothing after, and so they do everything they can to gain all the power and become immortal before death. Like, obviously if you're immortal you don't die, but none of them have been able to become immortal at this point, so they're trying to become immortal before they die. That's their whole goal. But what Yoda then finds out is that actually the true power, the true goal, the best thing that you can have is to become one with the Force, that you die, but you have the ability to then still manifest yourself and be able to commune with the living. And so to really complete the story, so to speak, it would be best if then we see the final kind of act of Luke's journey, or the Skywalker journey, is that Luke then travels and learns how to become one with the Force. Now, this is then me jumping past what we see from the Clone Wars and what happens there. Well, first I'll just kind of cover like where, obviously it would travel. We could see all these new worlds, all these, beautiful new places, or dark, scary new places where Luke's tested, where you don't have to weaken the character to someone that everyone doesn't, see as the person who he is, where he's changed to become this weird person that you have to create a headcanon for yourself to be able to explain how it really even makes sense. But instead, you allow him to be who he is, but you put him into a situation where he's not overpowered, that the situation he's in is kind of too much for him at the beginning, and he will have to grow and become stronger to be able to get to where he's at, to be able to become one with the Force. And so I think that it could make perfect sense. You could be able to add in these things like what we've seen with Yoda, where again, yes, we've seen it in the Clone Wars, but the mass audiences haven't seen it, and it can be done a slightly different way, because Luke won't have the same temptations and testings as Yoda did. But you can go and take him to Morrowind. You can begin to see people like Darth Bane, and you can begin to see some of these past things that then, for me, what would be best done is, because at the very end Yoda asks if he can see the face of one of the Wills, and she takes off her face and then just it collapses. She doesn't have any face. She doesn't exist in that way. And kind of the thought that I had behind it is that they are ultimately, because Qui-Gon on Dagobah says that you're one of the chosen, Yoda, that you're one of the chosen to be able to have the testing to be able to become one with the Force, that you can manifest yourself after death. What I kind of feel like could at least be made into the storyline is that these Wills were a grouping of Jedi that thousands of years before, say in the Old Republic, learned of this as well. And then once they learned of it, because Yoda went on his own and kind of learned this secret himself and only told a few people, being like Obi-Wan, and then Obi-Wan and Yoda being together obviously kind of told Luke about this, but he didn't go and tell the rest of the Jedi like, hey, look, I found this thing out that allows me to become one with the Force later, because they didn't really believe that, and because they weren't part of the chosen ones. So these Wills could be part of the Jedi that were from the Old Republic, and now they don't show their faces, because the only reason Obi-Wan and Yoda reveal themselves to Luke is because Luke needs to know who they are at the time, because he's one, not prepared to learn all the testing with the Wills, that's 7, 8, and 9, but instead he just needs someone to be able to grow him for where he's at now. So it doesn't change the victory of everything that happened, that Luke beating the Empire by tossing away his lightsaber ended up changing the galaxy for hundreds of years to come. That victory, that celebration, everything we saw is exactly true. It doesn't affect any of it. But now we see a whole nother aspect of the Force. We see the final completion of the Skywalker saga, with Luke finally, by the end of it, becoming one with the Force after going through these new challenges that can test him without making him weak. And then by seeing what happens, and the main audiences that know who the Skywalkers are and thus will all watch, like everyone in the world went to go watch The Force Awakens when it began to come out, is instead you see that, and then you have these questions of who is Darth Bane? Who are these Wills? How do we know them? Like, who, how did they know all that's going on? asking questions like Yoda was, but also because we see all these things. Then when you begin to tell the story and you move to the Old Republic and start telling that, it's not just the fans that's read the books or played the games. Now all of the audiences, the mass audience that begins to see, oh, this is the Old Republic. Oh, remember I heard that in episode 8 and episode 9 when Luke was being tempted. And then you can begin to tell that story. And that story can lead over 9 to 12 movies of telling the story of the Sith Wars, of the Jedi, beginning to build of the Jedi Order, getting to the point where it ends with Darth Bane and kind of having a trilogy about him creating the rule of 2. And the point would be that you would begin to see, as George Lucas says, that there's this kind of poetic kind of rhyming to the stories, is that they defeated the Sith at that point. And that led to 1,000 years of peace between, of the galaxy. Same thing happens here with Luke and his battle with Darth Sidious, that Bane changed the rule of what the Sith was. Before there was the Sith Wars where there's just, thousands of them. But as Darth Bane says, that they would end up killing each other to gain power. He changes it to the rule of 2. And so in that, there was a whole different type of battle that happened that still compared the Sith and the Jedi had to defeat the Sith, as we see with Luke defeating the Sith and what happened with Return of the Jedi. But that period of time, that's where they developed that the Wills waited until the Sith began to gain power, and because we could only fully grow when we're being challenged. If you're never tested, if you're never kind of, having the struggle, you can't fully grow. So that's why they never tried to train up anyone to become, one with the Force until Sidious and the Sith began to rise up in power, and then they needed that to happen. And so my idea is, after this story happens, and you get to see this new kind of story with Luke and what's going on, I think that it would be best if you at least started the development of the worlds and the directing with like a Guillermo del Toro. He's really ingenious about creating worlds and creating these weird, creepy creatures. And I think him and George Lucas working together, it's George Lucas's idea, concept, and large screenwriting. And I think Guillermo can kind of help a little bit with the writing, and then them two putting together and working to create this world, to create this kind of different place that we've never seen before. I think that would be absolutely brilliant. And obviously Guillermo del Toro can direct very well. And I think that would be a perfect combination. Whether or not he directs multiple ones or not, I think that he needs to be one of the main directors that kind of begins it for just the creation of the world, to create something completely new that we've never experienced and never seen. And he is very good at developing entire worlds for us to kind of get into and accept. And then, so once that happens, it goes and you develop the Old Republic, and you do the same thing that they're doing now with every other year, is when it happens and you have a solo, kind of a solo story, a Star Wars story in between. And so if you do 9 to 12 episodes of the Old Republic, then that's 24 to 25 years later. And in 2045, you can start a new story that's like 500 to 1,000 years after the original trilogy. And that's where then, of course, sadly, probably Mark Hamill and even Ewan McGregor will be dead by that point, but they can return as the new Wills. That those Wills, their job was to accomplish and get to the point where they're at. And then because Yoda and them don't know them, and they're supposed to be one with the Force because they're Wills, it's not about who they are, because it's the Sith that want to gain this power for their name. The Jedi don't. So at the point when the people that are coming to learn from them would never even recognize who they are, they cover themselves. They won't reveal their faces. And so when it comes to later, in 2045, you tell this same story and you can have the voices being Luke or, Mark Hamill, someone, they would have to have someone that would try to copy it but make it close enough where we would know, we would just hear the voices and we would know that's Obi-Wan, that's Luke, that's Yoda. And then that could begin to open up the eyes of kids in that point. They'd be like, hey, you want to see this movie that happened 80 years ago that started this? How about we know who's in that mask? You want to see his life story? We know who's in this mask. You want to see his life story? I just think that would be much more interesting. I've run on and on about all of this. I had notes that I was supposed to look at that were supposed to keep me a little more on topic, but I kind of just let the ideas kind of run, word vomit them out, unfortunately. But anyways, that's my thoughts on all of this. I think that it could have worked. Again, there's a chance that it won't work, but everyone just blindly says it wouldn't work. It'd be like Osmosis Jones, that you'd just be going into the blood cells to follow midichlorians around. And I think that's completely misrepresenting it. One, I think you should go and watch, if you have not seen it, they're on Netflix. Season 6, they're called The Lost Missions, and then episodes 11, 12, and 13, where you can see Yoda going through this. And it's a very interesting, I enjoy it very much. It would make, to me, it's much more Star Wars than anything we've gotten so far with Disney. And that's not just trying to hate on Disney. It's the fact that Star Wars has always been something different. There's always been more of a depth to it. And I think that kind of just going completely against this kind of huge blockbuster action war type thing, but making it into something just you wouldn't expect if you haven't been following Star Wars and you don't know some of these things, like the vast majority of people responding now saying, this is a terrible idea. I think that there's potential that it could have been a really good idea and it could have worked really well. And those are my reasons why. Those are the things I think that could have been done. I think it would have worked out well for Star Wars for the next 50 years. Where if you did this and developed it so that people would be interested in the Old Republic, and then you could jump back and connect it again, that could then draw audiences back to looking at what happened with the original trilogies and even the prequels. And I think that that would have been absolutely awesome. But anyways, those are my ideas on what it could have been and how it could have worked, because no one else wants to talk about the potential that it actually could have worked out. And so I wanted to do that. I hope you enjoyed it. I look forward to hearing all your thoughts and opinions, maybe some adjustments to how they could do things slightly different, or whether I'm an idiot and that you think that it wouldn't work at all. Whichever it is, I look forward to hearing your thoughts and discussing them with you down below. Thank you very much for watching. And never forget, you Nerf herders, I love you.